Hey, I'm Steve. We're going to talk about some stuff today. I'm here with Nick, the engineer and sound producer, and Nick is wearing a red sweatshirt that says, "Just do it." That's what we're going to do today. We're just going to do it.
Thank you, Captain Obvious, for saving the day.
Captain Obvious. Okay, that's what it says. Nike, just do it. So today, Nick, I want to talk about a guy named William Wilberforce. And what I have noticed today is that people, not to categorize you or to stereotype you, Nick, or a lot of people actually, is they've never heard about William Wilberforce, a historical figure. Have you ever heard of him?
Of course I've heard of William Wilberforce.
Is that because I told you the other day?
No.
Okay. So William, tell me one thing about William Wilberforce.
His middle name is actually Wilberforce and his last name is Edmund. So WWE. He actually, his offspring founded the WWE and named it after him.
I'm glad that you are incorrect. And anyway, William Wilberforce. So William Wilberforce is responsible for ending slavery in the British Empire. And I think he's one of the original champions of social justice, of fighting evil and oppression. And I think we can learn a lot from historical figures and how they approach different kinds of issues. So let me give you an example. If we lived in a country where we were persecuted in an open way, we can learn a lot from second century Christians who were persecuted. We can learn how they dealt with suffering, how they dealt with governmental pressure, and just those things like that. So I think from historical figures, we can learn how we can respond to personal issues today or even societal issues. And so slavery is one of those issues in which I think as we look at Wilberforce, we can look at his life and say, what principles did he live by that would be helpful for us today in thinking about injustices? So let me tell you just a little bit about Wilberforce. He was born probably in about 1760, and he was a member of Parliament in England. And Wilberforce was, I would say, small in stature from what I've read, but he was very persuasive in his communication. His oratory was sweet. And so Wilberforce grew up, I would say, in a kind of a suburb of London. He was fairly well educated. His father was a businessman. I wouldn't say an upper level businessman, but then Wilberforce's father passed away when he was young, and then his grandfather passed away when he was at the university, and he inherited a great sum of money. And I think Wilberforce's early years are what a lot of college students are. And when he was young, he had a somewhat of a conversion experience or religious experience, let me put it that way, and he went off to college and left it all in the ditch. You know, he partied hard. He knew what a kegger was, if they would have had him in those days. And his life was he was just a wild party guy. And so Wilberforce, through a series of events, came to know Christ as his Savior. And he said it was the most deeply held joy he had ever experienced was coming to Christ in his early 20s. I'm going to say it that way. And so Wilberforce, at that point, began to have a change internally in his life. He had been an opium addict, probably somewhat of a drunk. I wouldn't say an alcoholic. And those things began to change in his life. And the most pressing issue for him was slavery. He said, this has got to stop. And Wilberforce ran for Parliament. That was one of his objectives because that's where the places of influence would be. And basically in those days, you had to kind of buy your way into Parliament. And he didn't come from that Parliament lineage, royalty, aristocracy. Hence, he had to use his inheritance to buy his way in to that place of Parliament. And they're called MPs, Member of Parliament. So Wilberforce joins Parliament, and he begins to speak vocally about slavery issues, and he becomes friends with some prominent Christians. One is John Newton. And Nick, you're a musician. I mean, you know about John Newton?
Oh my gosh.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot. So John, do you?
I'm thinking of Isaac Newton right now, and that's completely different.
John Newton was a slave trader, and he got saved, and he's responsible for that song, Amazing Grace. Amazing, because he experienced a deep change in his life because of Christ. And obviously abandoned his slave trading ways. So Wilberforce began to rub shoulders with people like William Pitt, John Newton, other kind of influential Christians of his day, and it just enriched his life. And Wilberforce then began to be strengthened in his resolve to see an end to the slave trade. Wilberforce began to take the floor of Parliament and would persuasively speak against slavery, the evils of it. He also spoke against other things in the British Empire that were wrong. And so Wilberforce began to get the reputation of being the moral soul of Parliament in the British Empire. It'd be like somebody saying, so-and-so is the morality soul of the U.S. Senate. And that became William Wilberforce. After a period of time, Wilberforce was fighting slavery in Parliament. He became exhausted physically. It was just a tremendous amount of energy told to this. And then he got married and had, all accounts, a fantastic marriage. And they had 6 kids. And he was so committed to his children, he about quit Parliament because he thought, my number one task in life needs to be the education of my children and their spiritual development. And I can't do what I'm doing here in Parliament and raise these 6 kids and have the family life that I want to have. So he was conflicted about that. His wife and his friends convinced him that he could do both. And so Wilberforce continued down that path of fighting slavery. One of the unique things about Wilberforce, people who knew him and wrote about him would say that if he was engaged in a room talking to people and there were children in the room, he would always want to go and play games with the children or talk to kids. He was kind of like a modern day youth pastor, had the gift of woo, and that was Wilberforce. And he would use those skills that he had to influence people in a direction. And what I found is that Wilberforce, with all of his might, was able to end slave trading in the early 1800s. So the slave trade in Britain ended, I think, in 1807. Somebody will probably correct me, but it's somewhere in there. And then it wasn't until years later that, actually 1833, that slavery was abolished. So you couldn't own slaves. So they ended the trade first. Wilberforce was able to get that accomplished. And then years later, it was against the law to even own slaves. What's so interesting to me is that law to end the owning of slaves in England happened the year that Wilberforce died. And in fact, he died first, and then the law was passed. So in my mind, I look at this guy and I think, holy cow, he spent his life on this one issue, and while he was alive, he didn't even get to see the end result. And I think for a lot of us, we need to remember that the things that we put our efforts to, we may not see the result of that during our lifetimes. And we have to be okay with that. So Wilberforce put up the good fight. And so years ago, I was reading about Wilberforce, and I came to some lessons on how Wilberforce confronted social evil during his time frame. I want to go over those. I got 7 of them. Nobody will remember 7, but...
Well, 7 is one of the most important numbers in the Bible, so that's kind of ironic.
Hey, you are correct. 7. We can do this. The first one is that I think he rejected radicalism. Now, you might say, well, what is that? What do you mean by that? Well, at the time he lived, the French Revolution was going on, and so the people in France were using the guillotine and just murdering all the government officials because they disagreed with them. And Wilberforce didn't want to be extremely violent like the French Revolution and Thomas Paine and those folks. So Wilberforce worked within the legislature tirelessly to effect that change, which then became long-lasting. So I think that's one thing that he did. The second thing I think that we can learn from Wilberforce is that he was deeply committed to Jesus Christ. And he rejected some of the secular notions of his day that were unpopular and kept his foundation in Christ. And that kept him, I would say, well-grounded during his lifetime as a member of Parliament. The third thing I think that Wilberforce did that we need to really take notice of in fighting evil is that he stressed the practical nature of Christianity. And by that I mean he was a follower of Jesus, and he said time and time again that he had deep joy from his fellowship with Christ. In other words, he often stressed that following Christ has tremendous benefits for a person. It spiritually impacted his life, and he wanted to share that with people. So when he talked about following Jesus, he was not an ivory tower academic. He spoke from the heart as one that had been truly changed. In other words, I think he was incredibly authentic about his faith. Hey, I used to be this party guy. I used to be having an opium problem. I used to drink way too much, and man, my life has changed. So he stressed the practical nature of things. And I think when we fight a social injustice, we need to reiterate those things to people that Christ can change things and can change us personally. I think a fourth thing that Wilberforce did is that he used his skills of persuasion to talk to people and influence them. He used his education, a Cambridge-trained person. He leveraged, that's what I want to say, he leveraged those things to make changes. He leveraged his position as a member of Parliament to effect change, and he was tireless at it. So he leveraged those things. The other thing that he did was that he was patient and persistent, and I think that's something that we can learn from, because just don't give up. Whatever that social injustice or thing that is morally evil, that I think we can be patient in that fight and persistent at it. He spent his life doing it. And in fact, as I said earlier, he died in 1833. The law to abolish slavery was passed a few months after he died. And so he kept at it to the very end. The other thing that I want to comment on, that he relied on his Christian friends to make a change. And this is what happened. So there's a kind of a suburb of London called the Clapham area, and he would meet at somebody's house with prominent, influential Christians. Influential would be a better word. And some of those names are like Granville Sharp, a solid Christian man who taught Greek at Cambridge. Just many others that met there, and they discussed how they would effect change. And I think from that, we need to be in a community together with people for mutual strength in fighting against moral evils of our day. And he relied on the Christian community for that. And they met consistently, frequently, and they strategized, they prayed. And I think that we need that in those times when we stand against any kind of injustice, whether racial injustice or human trafficking or whatever that, because so many things would fall under that category. And that he relied on that tight-knit group faith community. We got to have that. And then the last thing that I learned from studying Wilberforce's life is that you identify a social evil and you oppose it with all your might. Now, not everybody's going to jump on all these things, and I realize that, because maybe God's called you to something different, whatever that is. There are so many things that are good things that we could be involved in. You got to pick and choose. But man, if your thing is fighting injustices, oppose it for everything you got. And see what God can do in those areas as well. So originally, when I began to study Wilberforce, I was thinking about the abortion issue, because I'm pro-life. I think the Bible teaches that life begins at conception, and a bunch of scriptural reasons for that. But yet, how does one go about talking about abortion? It's a very difficult thing. Or racial inequality or social injustice issues. How do we approach those things? And I just think that looking at people who have gone down that road, whether it's Wilberforce or somebody else, that we can learn lessons from them on how to approach those issues. Certainly, his context is different. England, a couple hundred years ago. But certainly, evil is evil and righteousness is righteousness. And following Jesus hasn't changed compared to a couple hundred years ago or a couple thousand years ago. So we can approach fighting social evil from learning from those who have gone before us. And sometimes we discount them. I even see that with Martin Luther King in a way today. I've been reading some of King's sermons and appreciating some of the things that he preached about. And I even think today some people even ignore him a little bit. You know, the lessons that you can learn from Martin Luther King or anybody else that would fall into that category of fighting something that's morally evil. So Wilberforce, I think, is when it came to the slavery issue, the prominent person, I would say, in Europe, England, and America to get that ball rolling. One of the pastors, very famous in Wilberforce's early years, was John Wesley, Anglican priest, the founder of Methodism. And Wesley wrote consistently against the scourge of slavery in Britain. So those kinds of things all added up for Wilberforce and contributed to his vociferous opposition to this moral evil. And eventually that had to spread to the United States, but it was painful by the time it got to the United States. So when I look at these social injustice things, one of the people I think about is William Wilberforce. I've been asking people lately, hey, have you ever heard of William Wilberforce? And people go, oh, who's that? And I'm thinking, oh, you got to know about this guy. So I encourage you to go read a book about William Wilberforce. Look at some articles about him. See about his life. Take notice of his persistence. He never gave up on fighting some of these things. Doesn't mean that he never took a rest or a break or those things, but man, he was all over this issue. It was his issue. And he set out to change England, and he did. So even in the United States, one person, a group of people can make a difference. So anyway, Nick, you got any thoughts about some of the things I just talked about, Wilberforce?
I would just say that it's very inspiring to hear the story because obviously he set out with a mission. He accomplished it, even though it wasn't necessarily in his lifetime. His full vision was essentially accomplished. But also I think the beautiful thing about him that he sets an example for is just caring about something and speaking up about it. And I feel like the younger generation that is out there right now, they care. They have a lot of things they care about, and they're willing to stand up for those things. And I admire that. And I hope that we as the church can kind of take that from his story and also just from the people around us and truly decide to care about things that are important to us and take a stance on it, whether that's just outreach, whether that's discipleship, whether that's standing up against abortion, standing up against racial injustice, that we would do a good job of showing that we care, and also that we care for people, because I feel that a lot of people who have grievances with the church is because they feel like we don't care about them, or because we've said, or in the past, there's like a negative history. So there's definitely conviction in that, but moving forward, something that I want to do personally, and I hope that the church can accomplish, is just showing that we care and that we're willing to stand up and take a stand against injustice.
Yeah, I think that's great. You kind of reminded me, Nick, that I make it sound like Wilberforce was a one-horse person with the slavery issue, but actually he tackled other things like poverty, and he gave away vast sums of money, but strategically to help people. And he belonged to some other, back in that day, they were called societies. I don't know what we'd call it today. Think tanks? I don't know. Groups of people, ministries. Maybe we call them ministries. So to societies that were doing incredible work with poor and education and children. So he was all about people and caring for people. So I think it's a great point that we don't get so lost in the issue that we forget about people, and that we care deeply for people's lives and just help people. I think it's great. Well, that's Stuff with Steve today. And next time we're going to talk about the Civil War and why some churches were preaching that slavery is okay, and then across town on the same Sunday, other churches preached that it was bad. So we're going to talk about that next time as we think about William Wilberforce and slavery.